Okay. Yes. So we have been talking about romantic literature or with a special focus on romantic poetry. We said that romantic poetry or romantic literature was individualistic. It was subjective. It was personal. And we had all these different writers. For example, we had first generation of romantic writers like Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Coleridge. Coleridge being more of a critique than a poet, and Wordsworth was the greatest poet of all the romantic, writers, romantic poets. And then we had second generation, we can say, our younger romantics like uh, Keats, Byron, Lord Byron,
Byron.
Shelley, B.B. Shelley, and all these writers we discussed at length in the previous lecture. So in today's session, in today's class, we are going to talk about the romantic, the Victorian temper. So we are going to talk about your unit number, block number fourth talks about the 19th century literature. So today, in today's lecture, in today's class, we are going to talk about the Victorian period or 19th century literature, we can say. So romantics, as I already told you that, they were high toned, they were otherworldly, they were exclusive, they were not concerned with the matter as a subject, as a separate. So there is always this action and reaction, as I have been telling you that the scientific principle, Newton's law of motion, the third law of motion says that to every action there is equal and opposite reaction. So the same can be applied, the same can be related to the literature also, because the preceding age is always a reaction. The following age is always a reaction to the preceding age. Okay, so action and reaction in the context of literature always happens, isn't it? So, Victorian age or Victorianism, the age of Victorian period, the age of Victorianism, we can say is also a kind of reaction against romanticism. So, what happens in Victorian age? What was the spirit? What was the tone or what was the mood of this Victorian age, of this particular age called a Victorian age? We are going to talk about all these things. So when we talk about the age of 19th century or the Victorian period, the temper of the age was rejecting sober age. What was romantic? Romantic age was all about sobriety. It was a sober age. As I told you that literature, whatever literature was produced in this particular age, it was subject to in nature. And, in fact, there's a claim against, John Keats does that, maybe. He says that, for example, he talks about in reference to Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, he says that he was so egotistical. That is why you had that piece called Egotistical Sublime. He says that Wordsworth was very kind of, all these poets, especially Wordsworth. He says that Wordsworth was so narcissist, we can say. He talked about himself, isn't it? In fact, all the literature, romantic literature, it was exclusive, it was individualistic, it was personal, it was subjective, it was not objective. Okay, so that is why the Keats, John Keats, he passes on a comment. He says that, uh, for him, Wordsworth was not an ideal. He was not his ideal. He made Shakespeare as an ideal because he thought that the poet or a writer should have that kind of quality called negative capability. Negative capability means when you negativate yourself, because he's thought that Shakespeare is the only writer who produced a number of characters in his plays, and that is why he thought that Shakespeare, for him, Shakespeare was his guru, his idol. And that is how the temper of age, the temper of this age of the temper of the Victorian age was rejecting sober age. What was sober age? So romanticism was all about sobriety. It was romantic age was a sober age, we can say. So different ideals were accommodated. So the attempt in this age was to reconcile them. So sometimes we say that there is a particular term associated with this age. It is, the age of compromise. The term compromise is kind of associated with this age, because this age talks about all about, it's all about the age of reconciliation. It is all about the age of compromise. Now, what compromise, in what sense, in what what does compromise mean here? I will talk about it in some time. So Victorians, when we talk about all these Victorians, for example, you have the early Victorians called like Alfred Tennyson and Browning, etc., Rossetti, the other poet. All these Victorians, they kind of they were very, they were confused between science and religion. So Victorians, but overall Victorians were, they were committed to religion. They were committed to religion, and these, in this age, different ideas were accommodated, and the attempt was made to reconcile them. So there was this, science, because scientific developments were taking place. You had, for example, Darwin talking about his theory of evolution, where origin of species, isn't. So he comes up with that theory called theory of origin of species. We are doing block number fourth. Please go to unit 16. We are talking about the background to the 19th century or to the Victorian age. So this age is, age of compromise, we can say. This age is the age of reconciliation, because there was, there were scientific developments happening. For example, I took the name of, Darwin, he came up with a theory of evolution of species, or theory origin of species, isn't. And then you had William Harvey talking about blood circulation, and we had some other scientists also, like Huxley, etc. So Victorians, we can say, they to begin with, they were actually the men of religion. They were committed to religion in a way, and it was a reaction against romantics, isn't it? Against romantic age, romantic period. So Victorian age, as I told you, that it was the age of science and religion. Scientific, there were many scientists, talking about their theories, talking about, there were many scientists, prevalent in this age. And religion, all these writers were actually talking about religion. So there was this kind of, we can say, these two things were there in this particular age, and that is why they kind of compromised between science and religion. That is why we say that this age is also called as age of compromise. So there was this reconciling literature, which is, literature which was produced was reconciliatory in nature. It was reconciling in nature. Okay. So we have the first Victorian called Thomas Carlyle. Thomas Carlyle was, he came up with this book called Sartor Resartus. It was published in the year 1838. It talks about, Thomas Thomas Carlyle. He talks about a man, he was a man with having, multidimensional personalities. He talks about him. And he was a man of who he talks about a man who is a man of letters. Who he talks about a man who lives a practical life. And he also wrote, Thomas Carlyle, the first Victorian writer. He came up with his book called The French Revolution, which was published in the year 1837, and which marks the beginning of the Victorian period also. So Victorian period, when we talk about Victorian period, it begins with the year 1837. And he says that, in that particular book, he talks about the French Revolution, which had taken place earlier, 1789. And also we had somebody like, as I earlier told you, Charles Darwin, scientist, who comes up with a theory of evolution. What does he say in that theory of evolution? In his theory, he says that man is just a improved species. He talks about he kind of draws a relationship between man and monkey and man. He says that basically man was Basically, once upon a time, it was, man was a monkey, and it was with the illusion, he became a man. He became a man. So he says that man is an improved form of species. Man will improve upon other species. Okay, so he says that man is just an improved species of monkey. And William Harvey was another scientist who belonged to this age, who talked about, who gave us the theory of, who talked about blood circulation thing, isn't it? And tempo of the age, as I already told you, that there were so many changes. It was taking the hue, it was taking the change, and the greatest factor in this particular age was industrialization. Industry were setting place, isn't in the industries were being set up in this particular age, and industrialization was at its peak, we can say, in this particular age. And when we talk about and Queen Victoria, in fact, I told you that Queen Victoria had ruled in this particular age. She ruled from 1837 to 1901. Uh, that are the dates for Victorian period or Victorian age. And we had yet another scientist who is known as Henry
Sir,
Cardinal.
sorry to interrupt. Sir, please mention the year once again of the Victorian.
Yeah, Victorian age, it marked, the dates are 1837 to 1901. This is the age of Victorian period, the age of Victorian literature, or Victorian age simply, Victorianism we can say. So, and Queen Victoria, and it was actually this period, this age was named after Queen Victoria, who was a queen at that point of time in England. And yet another scientist, we had some other scientist also called as, named as Henry Cardinal Newman. Now, Newman is known for, he talked about the idea of education. He gave, he, for the first time, we have somebody talking about the idea of education, idea of a university, that we will talk about. And yet another figure, the other literary figure, Matthew Arnold. I'm sure you might have heard of him, Matthew Arnold, A Poet and a Critique. Okay, so all these writers, all these people, all these writers, especially in this particular age, they try to do what? They try to maintain the religious values. What they talked about, the science also, they promoted scientific principles also, but in their writings they try to maintain the religious values also. And they found the alternate ways, we can say, they found the alternate the ways to attack science and maintain the religious values. So that in a way, that is why it is called as age of compromise. Age of compromise. So now Matthew Arnold comes up with his book, the famous writing called Culture and Anarchy. Culture and Anarchy, he talks about these two things in that particular book. He says that any nation which is without culture must perish or will perish. Okay, in the book called Culture and Anarchy, Matthew Arnold, who is a poet, a Victorian poet, and a critic also, he comes up with his famous book called Culture and Anarchy, where he talks about a nation which is without culture will perish one day. And he says that culture has two components. He says that light and sweetness. He says that culture has two components called light and sweetness. And these two things, that is light and sweetness, they are like the metaphors of enlightened mind. Culture is what? Light is metaphor for an enlightened mind, metaphor for an open mind, metaphor for a critical mind, a reasonable mind, not fanatical one. And sweetness, on the other hand, is the metaphor for matter of conduct. It is the metaphor for matter of conduct. It means that How do you behave with the other people? How do you behave with other community? How do you behave with other group? How do you behave from? How do you behave with other race? People from other race, people from other region, etc. People speaking other language, etc. So he gave us these two terms. He says that culture, culture and anarchy. In that particular book, he defines culture. What is mean, by culture? He says that there are two components. One is light and sweetness. By light, he means that one should have a reasonable mind. One should have an enlightened mind. One should have a critical mind. One should, one should think in terms of logic, rationality, rationalism, etc. And on the other hand, sweetness, he refers to the matter of conduct. He says that how do you behave with other person, how do you behave the people from other community, from other group, people speaking other tongue, the group which comes from from other place, etc., which is of a different race, etc. So that is what he says in that particular book called Culture and Anarchy. And Newman, Henry Newman, who was a scientist, he wrote a book on education. Henry Newman, he wrote a book on education called, the title of the book was Idea of a University. So he basically, in that book, for the first time somebody is talking about a university. He talks about the form, the structure of a university. He talks about how does a university look like, and what is the structure of a university? What should be the structure of the university? What are like the different components in a university? What are the different constituents? We can say the components of a university. He says that university is open for all, as a term suggests. University, he says that it is something which is open to all. It is a seat of highest learning, as we define university as the seat of learning, highest learning. So what happens in a university? All disciplines, all subjects of knowledge come together, and they are all disciplines are welcome in a university: sciences, social sciences, arts, engineering, pharmacy, so on and so forth. So all these, we have all these events taking place. We have all these scientists, all these writers talking about all these things. So this age was the age of industrialization. The age was the age of religion. Basically all these Victorian writers, for example, Tennyson was the most conservative of them all. That is, religious conservative. Browning, all these people, Matthew Arnold, they were all people of, people of religion. They were committed to their religion. But scientific principles were, taking place at the same time. We had Darwin talking about theory of evolution, theory of evolution. Sorry, we had other people talking about other things. Blood circulation, for example, thing was propounded by William Harvey, and all the industrialization was happening at the same time. So these writers actually, they found kind of options, or they found ways to attack science in one way or another way, and but at the same time they maintained those spiritual values or religious values. So earlier, when we talk about the now, there is the Victorian age can be divided into earlier period, into early and later period. Okay, so earlier period of Victorian, it was dominated by culture, but the later part was dominated by arts, isn't it? So because you had in the first period, for example, all these people belong to the first period of Victorianism, or first period of Victorian age. That is Tennyson, Browning, etc., and Matthew Arnold also, because Matthew Arnold, he gave us that concept called culture and anarchy, where for the maybe for the first time culture was defined, or defined by by someone. And that is why earlier period of, so for the earlier period of Victorianism is concerned, or Victorian age is concerned, it was completely dominated by culture. And but the later part of this age, later part of this remaining part of this age was dominated by arts, where that slogan came. where writers talked about, where this particular writer talked about Henry, what was his name? Parter. He talked about Parter. He talked about art for art's sake. So art was prevalent, we can say dominant in that particular period, in the later part of that's in the later part of the Victorian period. So because in industry, science, all these things were talked about, and that is how the idea of compromise came. Later period of the Victorian period is the reaction to the earlier period. So it was for the first time, as I told you, that later part was all about art. It was all about the promotion of art. So we have this slogan called "Art for Art's sake." So somebody, a writer called, William Parter, talking about art for art's sake. He says that art should be promoted, art should be recognized for the promotion of the art. For example, we have different arts, music, we have literature, we have painting. So he says that it should be inward looking. So kind of he goes back to the Renaissance age, the previous age, this particular person. He says that we should seek excellence in structure and style. And that is why Pater and his contemporaries went back to the Renaissance. So that in a way talks about Renaissance periods. He says that art should be only for the art's sake. Art should not be for culture, for other things. And that's why William Barter and his contemporaries went back to the Renaissance, and he wrote a book on Renaissance. And he
One
wrote,
minute, sir. Excuse me, sir. Will you repeat the sentence that he says that excellence and
yeah, he says that we should seek excellence in structure and style. Okay, and it was for the first time somebody talking about art. The later part of the Victorian period, Victorianism is all about art. The first period was all about culture. Okay, because earlier, you had people like Tennyson, you had people like all these poets, Tennyson, Browning, and especially Matthew Arnold, who was the dominant figure of the age. Because he talked about culture. So this age, the first part is dominated by culture, where people started talking about culture. And in fact, Matthew Arnold was the first person who talked about it, who spoke about it, and then came other people. And later on, the other period, the later period of Victorian age or Victorianism is known for art, for the promotion of art, because we have this man called William Pater, who said that no, we should go back to Renaissance. Art should be for the art's sake. Art should not be for some other sake, for the promotion of culture, for the promotion of other things. So elder Victorians, like for example Arnold, Tennyson, Newman, they kind of, we can say, compromised here. They Arnold, for example, you had Tennyson, you had Arnold, you had Newman, Henry Newman, who compromised because they said that he is a force that cannot be washed away, as it was the age of industry and technology. So he said that, they say that no, we cannot ignore these forces also, these events also, because industrialization was happening, as I earlier told you. It was the age of technology, technological developments were taking place. We had industries being set up. So all these, they said that no, these things cannot be washed away. These events cannot be forgotten. They cannot be compromised. Okay. So Pater said no, but Pater, in reaction, he said no. He tried to kind of, as I told you, that he tried to revive the Renaissance through painting, through different arts. So William Pater, he sought inspiration from Renaissance, uh, and it was late Victorians who said that no, we cannot separate arts from life, literature, music, painting. But William Pater was of the opposite view. He gave us the slogan called art for art's sake. But late Victorians like Arnold and all that, all those people, they said no, literature, art cannot be separated from other arts. Literature cannot be separated from other arts. For example, you have music, you have painting, you have other arts, etc. Okay, so art, they said that art has to have a link with life. Okay, art has to what? Art has to have a link with life. There has to be a connection of art with the life. Art cannot be de-linked with life. Earlier, William Pater was of the opposite view completely. And that is how we had this, kind of uh, uh, art pattern he was all the central figure in the later period. And art for culture, religion, art for education was the slogan in the earlier period. But Pater later advocated that art is not subsidiary. He said that no, art is not subsidiary to anything. Art is not a means. Art will advance its own interests. You cannot sell religion through art. So he was against it. He says that no, art for culture, art for religion, art for education was the slogan. It was the slogan in the earlier period, but he says that he advocated that art is not subsidiary. Art is not secondary to anything, be it anything. Art is not subsidiary to anything. Art is not a means. He says that art will advance its own interests. You cannot sell religion through arts. So because all these people, they were they had compromised. All these people, Matthew Arnold, all these people had compromised. That's why this age is sometimes known as the age of compromise. So they had mixed their right. They were talking about religious values. They were committed to their religion. So, but William Pater came and he said that no, he kind of opposed them. He said no, he says that art will advance its own interest. You cannot sell religion through art. So he basically, William Pater says that art cannot be sold through religion. You cannot sell religion through art. So he is completely against that. He says that art should be for the sake of arts only, and art should be for the sake of art, for the promotion of art only. You cannot sell religion through art, because all these people were kind of selling, art through, and kind of they were selling religion through art. So we have, when we talk about the Victorian poetry, so that was some we can say the background to the tone and tenor of the age, the mood of the age. So it was, we can say, the age of compromise, where writers talked about their religion in their writings, and they sold their religion through their art. But it was William Pater who said, no, you cannot do that. That is not just acceptable. And he completely opposed to these people, to these Victorian writers. And now we have, the famous Victorian poets like Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, who are in fact prescribed in your syllabus also. Alfred Tennyson, so far his dates are concerned, so far the dates are concerned, he was born in 1809, he lived up to 1892. The dates for Alfred Tennyson are 1809 to 1892. He was born in 1809 and died in 1892. Do you follow me?
Sir. Yes, sir.
How many of you are there? 43 people. Okay.
Yes, we are listening, sir.
Okay, fine, good.
Noting down.
Right, good.
Yes, sir, continue.
Okay, so now we have Victorian poets. For example, we classify them into first generation first generation Victorian poets, first generation poets, and second generation poets. We have, for example, Tennyson, Alfred Tennyson, whose dates are 1809 to 1892, and Robert Browning, the other great poet of Victorian, the other great and noted poet of Victorian age was Robert Browning, whose dates are 1812 to 1889. Okay, so Tennyson, when we talk about Tennyson, he was he was more conservative in his approach. He was hung up with myths and legends. He talked about, he was very kind of nostalgic in his, writings, nostalgia of what was not there. He's the central figure to the Victorian poetry. When we talk about nostalgia is one of the central themes, we can say, of Victorian poetry, and he talks about that. His poetry is very, very kind of nostalgic in nature, and he reflects, and in fact it reflects the mood of the age also. So what was the mood of the age? Mood was sad. Mood was, the so for the mood of this Victorian poetry, of mood of the Victorian age was concerned, it was sad, it was painful. We will talk about it. It was not romantic. Where they kind of talked about freedom, they talked about equality, democracy, etc. Romantic, which was up to 1837. So Victorian age, as I have already given you the dates for Victorian age, it was 1837 to up to the end of the century, 1895. So important events were taking place, as we have to talk about them, because all these events are related. They kind of influence literature in one way or in other way, as I have always been talking about it. And the important thing which happens in 1837 is the first reform bill. First reform bill came into existence. There was this bill passed, which happened in 1837. That is the first year of the beginning of Victorian age. And second reform bill came in, was passed in 1865. So what is 1837, the first reform bill, all about? It gave voting rights to the common people. So for the first time in the history, that common people could vote. They could cast their vote, and it happened. The bill was passed in 1837, and in 1837, and in 1865, what happened? Working class also got the voting rights. Okay, so the first time voting rights were given to the common people in 1837, and in 1865 there was the second reform bill which talked about giving voting rights to the working class. And we can say that it was for the first time democracy was extended to grassroots. So even when we talk about even there was no voting rights for women even until 1865. Women had no voting rights. Women had to fight. They had to wait for another 50 years. So it was 50 years later they got their voting rights. Finally, they got it in 1922. Women voting rights were given to the common people, to the working class, but it was not given to the women, to women, and they had to wait. They had to fight for it, and they finally got their voting rights in 1922. That is very important. You should note that down. As I have already been talking about, in fact, we have been talking
Excuse me,
about
sir.
it. Yes.
Working class got 1865 or 1965?
1865 working class.
Okay.
1837 common people got the voting right, and it was 50 years later, that is in 1922, women got the voting right. Okay, so that is what first First reform bill, second reform bill, and it was 50 years later women got the voting rights in 1922. And theory of evolution we have been talking about. Darwin, Charles Darwin, he said that there is nothing special about man, and he also gave a reference to, he said that Christianity said that man is the special being of God, and man has God-like qualities. So that is how the Victorian compromise. But the Victorians were, we can say they were not radical like that of romantics. So the mood, but their mood of the Victorian writers is concerned. So for the mood of the Victorian writers is concerned, it was acceptance. They compromised it because they sold religion through their writings. Okay, so there was this mood of acceptance in this particular age between Darwin and Christianity. They had to compromise because Darwin was talking about the origin of species, the evolution of man. He gave us a theory called evolution of man, where he said that man is nothing but the offshoot of monkey. We can say the improved species of monkey. So he basically talks about the evolution of man from monkey to man, isn't so all these writers, they had to compromise. They talked about the fallibility or weakness of a man. They accepted that, and they had to compromise between science and religion. That is again the age of compromise, we can say. So the leading poets of this age, they were seeking escape. They were they were really confronting different issues. They try to seek compensation in something which is not real. So for example, if we talk about the Tennyson's poem Ulysses, a famous poem by Tennyson, it glorifies the spirit of Ulysses. He talks about him, Ulysses, once a king. He talks about his spirit. He talks about he says that drinking life to lees, that is he says that life should be enjoyed to its fullest extent, isn't so the philosophy of it is sometimes known as Epicurean philosophy, also Epicureanism also. So Tennyson writes this poem where he talks about a king called Ulysses, and he talks about his spirit. He talks about his life, the life which should be enjoyed to the fullest extent. And he says that we should go on exploring life till end. That is what is drinking life to the lees. Drinking life to the lees, L-E-E-S, lees. Okay, so Victorians were, we can say they were trying to find solace. So they were trying to find comfort or satisfaction elsewhere. Listen, so Browning, when you talk about Browning, he talks straight about theme of love. He is not hung up with legends and myths. It's the love which is lost. For example, he talks about nostalgia. His poetry is very nostalgic in nature. He is not hung up with legends and myths as Tennyson was, which cannot be regained. So he says that his philosophy is that it is the love which is lost, which cannot be regained. So sense of loss. So we kind of find a sense of loss. That is one of the themes of his poetry. Sense of loss, sense of nostalgic feelings in his poetry. Browning's poem, for example, there is a poem by Robert Browning called uh, Pippa Passes, where the poet talks about a girl who sings, and her singing is important. He says, one who looks into nature, so inward looking, kind of, futuristic kind of thing with the hopes and aspirations. So Pippa Passes is basically a poem about a girl who sings, and her singing is important. Why? Because she looks into the future with hopes and aspirations. Other important poem by Robert Browning is the last ride together. Maybe you might have done it in your BA English course or BA English literature or BA general English in English. You might have done this poem. You might have gone through this poem. You know, the poem is titled as The Last Ride Together. Uh, Okay, the last ride together. It is very very nostalgic. The poet talks about a ride which yeah, he goes with his beloved, and he says that he says that it's a ride of joy for him. It is a ride of togetherness for him. It is the ride of consummation of love for him. So sense of that kind of loss or sense of nostalgia. This poem is very, very nostalgic in nature. He talks about the ride of union once he had with his beloved. So, uh, other figure, uh, other important figure, an important poet and a critic also called Matthew Arnold, who again talks about in his poetry we can find the sense of loss. And in his poetry, sense of loss becomes more agonizing. The sense of loss in Matthew Arnold's poetry becomes more painful because he is known for the poem. He wrote a poem called Dover Beach or Dover Beach. You may go through the poem. Please go through the poem. A very beautiful poem, and it is the representative of the age. When we talk about the age of Victorianism, of the age of the Victorian age, Victorian poetry, it is really the representative point of the Victorian age, because this age was all about compromise. It was compromise between religion, science and religion, isn't? So all these, so Dover Beach is a representative, very one of the lines where the poem goes. uh, the one of the lines I will read out for you. The sea of faith was once to the sea of faith was once too full. The sea of faith was uh, once too at the full, and round the earth the shore lay like the folds of a bright girdled further. So sense of kind of, he talks about the sea of religion, sea of faith. He talks about the religion. He says that it was once upon a time there was this people believed in religion, but that is maybe it has, it has been wiped away. It is gone. People are not very that kind, concerned particular about religion. They have kind of lost faith in their religion maybe, and they have kind of compromised on their religious values, and that is how we find that sense of loss in this particular poem. And I'm reminded of the last lines of the poem also, where he says, please go through the poem. It's a very beautiful poem, as I have told you that it's a representative poem of Victorian period. So all these writers, they came, they produced their pieces, but there was acceptance. The mood was of acceptance. The mood was of compromising or compromise. So accepting is all right, but with a more agonizing tone. It was found in the poetry of Matthew Arnold. Browning came up. He wrote his poetry. The tone was painful. Because he talked about the loss. He talked about nostalgia. We could feel the loss in, the sense of loss in his poetry. But when it comes to Matthew Arnold, he is, kind of, like a greater poet in that sense, because his poems or his poetry is known for, the painful experiences of his life. He talks about the painful. His tone of the poetry is more agonizing, we can say. The tone of his poetry is more painful, we can say, and it talks about his painful experiences of his life. So we have first generation who express themselves in poetry. Later on, it was felt that this medium of expression was not adequate. It was inadequate. It was not sufficient. And then we had, for example, we had Arnold, who came up with these essays called. Uh, it was Arnold's essays. Like he published two series of his essays called essays. They were called essays in criticism, critical essays. First issue series was published in 1865, which was, of course, you know his the first series got published in 1865, and the second series got published in 1889. So poetry, all these people, they were the great poets. You had Tennyson, you had Robert Browning, you had the other poet described in your syllabus is G.G. Rossetti, of course, a great poet. But the poetry, this medium of expression was not found adequate, was not sufficient to talk about the tone, tenor, the mood of the age. And it was Matthew Arnold who came up with his essays. He published his essays in two series. They were called as series number 1 and series number 2. So series number 1 was published, series first was published in 1865, and the second series was published in 1889. So the main essay in the first series is the study of poetry. Now, study of poetry is become very important here because he defines poetry or literature as a criticism of life. So he gave us this term called criticism. He says, no, poetry, as we have been already talking about, earlier, we say that, like Hamlet, Shakespeare says, in Hamlet, he says, looking up to the nature, looking up to the nature, looking up to the nature. But then came romantics. They said that looking into yourself, looking into thyself, isn't? Because their philosophy was inward. They believed in looking into. But this person, a 19th century poet and critic, the great Matthew Arnold, he says that no, literature, or he uses the term poetry. So we can poetry and literature, they are. We can say they can be used interchangeably. We can say so. Poetry, he says that poetry is the criticism of life. He says that again, poetry criticism means reflection. It is the same thing. It is mirroring life. It is all about dramatization. But he says that he gave us the term called criticism. He says that poetry is the criticism of life. And Browning, when you talk about Browning, he is credited with a new form of writing, which is dramatic, because he writes a poem called dramatic monologue. He gave us a different form of poetry, which is dramatic in nature, which is called as dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue is a monologue. It's not a dialogue, which gives a dramatic performance of a character. So he's known for that. Who? Robert Browning. And the greatest exponent of his poetry is called as dramatic monologue, as I told you. Arnold, when it comes to Arnold, he discarded both their manners or mood of expression. He discarded the modes or the manners of their expression. He discarded them both. That is Tennyson and Browning. He says that poetry, because he says that poetry has become critical now. Poetry has become critical now. Robert Browning and the other poet called as Tennyson, they were kind of, they had that nostalgia. It was dramatic. In fact, Robert Browning is known for that. He gave us a new form of poetry called a dramatic monologue, a kind of monologue where dramatic performance of the characters is seen, is witnessed. Now, but Arnold, he discarded the manner of their writing poetry. He says no, poetry has become critical now. So all now it is the criticism of life. Poetry is now the criticism of life, or the literature is the criticism of life. Okay, so that were the major Victorian poets, the writers we have been discussing. The age of, that is the age of Victorianism, the age of the Victorian period for you. Any questions? Anything?
Sir, thank you, sir. Sir, I have a question.
Please.
Now, I was writing about the comedy of manners. It was only talking about William Congreve, but I think you even spoke about, much ado about nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah. So when we write those answers, do we need to, keep in mind about everything that, or we just have to stick to one particular only William Congreve or so on, or
Yeah.
even
Yes.
write a little bit uh, of
Yeah.
Shakespeare?
Oh, yeah. It is. I think it is good if you give reference to other people. So so that your answer becomes kind of more solid. Maybe
Okay.
it is always good. It is always nice or better to to talk about other people. Say, for example, when just now I was talking about Matthew Arnold, who for the first time who said that poetry is a criticism of life. Then you can always, when you write the answer of your answer tomorrow in the examination, you can always say, you can always go back and you can always say that earlier it was defined like this. It was like, for example, Shakespeare said in his Hamlet, he says that looking up to the nature. You see, he talks about literature. He says that, or not, this Hamlet, Shakespearean play, he says that looking up to the nature, holding mirror up to the nature. Isn't Hamlet says that? So that is taken as one of the definitions of poetry, one of the definitions of literature. Then romantics came and they said that looking up to yourself, looking up to yourself, because they talked about themselves. They said their philosophy was to look within. Their philosophy was to look inwards. So they were individualistic. They talked about their selves. You can always do that. Your answer becomes more solid in that if you do that. And restoration, when you talk about restoration comedy, yeah, it is associated with William Congreve. But at the same time, other people might have talked about it, and it is good. The answer becomes more beautiful, more solid, more better, I can say, if you give references to other people. You can always, you can do that. That maybe if you do that, that can fetch you good marks also. Yes. Sarmaji is not here.
Sir, I am here. I forwarded
Okay, fine. I saw
chart,
that.
sir.
Yes. I saw that. Thank you so much.
Almost similar to what Mildred asked.
Okay, fine. Thank you. We have few more minutes left. I have left the room for discussion. If any questions, anything regarding the lecture, or if you want to raise a doubt, anything, you can ask that, or if you want to pass a comment also, you're welcome to do that. Yes. Any questions, anything? And any doubts so far? Or you want to say something, you want to speak something of your own or on your own?
Sir, one thing, sir, this is about a short question in the first paper relating to maybe its concept on culture and history.
Yeah, concept of
Concept of culture and history of YBE.
Okay.
This lesson is in unit 3, sir.
This lesson is
in Unit 3.
Unit 3, okay.
Sorry, not
English,
23. Unit 23.
23, okay. That is sailing to Byzantium.
Sailing to Byzantium and Easter.
Easter 1906. Yeah,
The
okay.
two poems are there, sir. But the second coming, another poem, which actually relates to this concept, is not appearing there. But very little information about culture and history, the concept of YB-AIDS is appearing in the lesson. Very short notes, very short material is there.
Okay.
So how
what
do
is,
we?
yes. What is the
How to?
page? Yes. Okay. What is the page number? You said
389.
381, sir.
Starts from 381, but the topic is at 389. Sailing to Byzantium.
Sailing to Byzantium. Okay. So
The second coming poem is not given there.
Second poem, yeah, second coming is not. That is by the same poet, W.B. Yeats, I think. Irish poet. He was an Irish poet. The second poem is not in your syllabus. Your second coming. Second coming is with regard to the Christ. He talks about the Christ who will come, for the second time. He will exist on this earth. I mean, he will come for the second time. And that's what he talks about it. And that is by the same poet called William W.B. Yeats. Yeats was an Irish poem, and he wrote very religious stuff. His the poetry, so far his poetry is concerned, he wrote that his poetry was rich in religious content, we can say. Like you have Sailing to Byzantium, you have this Second Coming. So all these poems are, they pertain to his religion. So kind of religious poems. You have now, if you talk about the other poem also, but you will be asked, so far your answers of your exam is concerned, you will be asked from the same thing, from the prescribed syllabus. So you won't be asked from anywhere else. So you don't need to bother about that. Now, if you want to go through the poem, for the further reading, you can do that. There's no harm in that.
Okay.
Yes. We will talk about it. I will give you some glimpse. I mean, the overall, the background, the overview of 20th century in the next class. I will talk about it. Okay. Yeah, it was. I'm reminded of, since you talked about W.B. Yeats. Yeah, W.B. Yeats was. He's in fact one of the greatest poets, and he came to know that Ezra Pound, you might have heard his name. He was one of the poets, one of the literary figures of 20th century, and it is being said that W.B. Yeats came to know that Ezra Pound had come to England. He was basically an Irish poet, and he went all the way from Ireland to England. His thought of meeting this literary giant called Ezra Pound, and then to his unfortunate, we can say, he handed over the poetry, whatever poetry he has written, and he was very excited, we can say, ecstatic to meet Ezra Pound. But Ezra Pound, he was very rude, we can say, kind of. He thought that he did not behave well with him. He said, "No, leave this poetry. This is rubbish." But Ezra Pound, because he was, a different kind of man. He was like a Hitler in the literary world. He rejected. He was very rude in his approach always. Um, he is known for writing those contours and all, and he is of course, he's the representative figure of his age. We will talk about it in the next class. I will touch upon it. But when it comes to when it comes to W. Yeats, he is one of the greatest poets of 20th century. Okay. I would like to stop here. Any questions? Anything? I will continue with it. I will
Nothing,
continue.
sir.
I will
Thank you,
continue
sir.
with it in the next class. We will turn up to tomorrow. In tomorrow's class, we will talk about the overview of 20th century. Okay. Fine. Thank you. Thank you for joining this online session.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, yes, please.
Sir, can you please explain in the next class the merits of Shakespeare according to Johnson?
Uh,
In the next class, can
okay,
you explain?
okay, fine. I will do that.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Okay, bye. Take care. We will see you in the next class.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, sir. Thank you.